All right, welcome back to the channel, everybody. I am Brian Lee Durfee, author of The Forgetting Moon and The Blackest Heart, both published by Simon & Schuster Saga Press. Today I am here in front of the Potomac River in Virginia and Mount Vernon to do a special writing advice and book review, and we're going to be reviewing His Excellency, the George Washington biography by Joseph J. Ellis. Now, we always talk about the covers first because you know I love cover design and graphic design and cover illustration. This is a nice painting of our first president here. I don't know who the artist was that did it. Looks like Gilbert Stuart from Rhode Island. I know Gilbert Stuart's from Rhode Island. I've been to his house. So that's the cover. We give it an A+ for cover. And the book itself is as excellent as our first president. That's why it's called His Excellency. Now, here at Mount Vernon and reading the book, I could do like a 7-hour video on all the stuff I've learned. But I'm just gonna hit a few of the highlights of the book that I really liked, and then we're just gonna talk about those things in general, and talk about why it's important, if you're a writer, to come to places like Mount Vernon and do writing research videos. So let's get into the book first, His Excellency. George Washington, our first president, that's what we know him as. One of the leaders of the Revolutionary War, him, crossing the river with the ice and the snow. Well, people knew about George Washington from when he was very young. In 1753, when he was 21 years old, he sort of became a national celebrity. He was a messenger, he was a young soldier, a messenger boy in the French-Indian War, and he had to deliver a message from Virginia up to Erie, New York. Might have been Erie, Pennsylvania. I don't remember the exact details of that. But it was a long adventure, and it was the dead of winter, and it was a harrowing adventure. It was through ice and snow, and they actually stumbled across a scene in a town that's actually named Murdering Town. And they came across a crazed Native American who they suspected had killed a family in Murdering Town. And the thing is when they let the Indian go, but when they found the family, the hogs were eating the flesh of the family. And it was just this whole adventure that was documented about George Washington that sort of thrust him into the limelight, almost as a young celebrity in early colonial times. So that's why people knew a lot about him. That's why he kind of had a sort of a rise to fame really early on. So when he became a grand general in the army, and when he fought in the Revolutionary War and he did great things, he was already sort of like a known entity. And this adventure he had, delivering this message to Erie through the ice and snow and through Murdering Town, it cemented his legacy early on as just somebody that could get things done. And up until that point, it was probably the widest read adventure story since the Lewis and comparable to the Lewis and Clark adventure out west. Anyway, that's one of the things. Another one of the points I wanted to make is George Washington. Here at Mount Vernon, there were a lot of enslaved people in Mount Vernon, and George Washington was very tortured by the fact that he owned slaves. He really wanted to free them, but the thing was they were kind of owned by a collective, and it wasn't his place to sell them. Not only that, but a lot of times when slaves were bought and sold, families were split apart, and he really the slaves that worked here really did sort of loved George Washington and his family and working here. And so he kind of kept them here safe as a way to just slavery was, it wasn't until 100 years later the Civil War freed the slaves, but it was certainly on the mind of a lot of people even 100 years prior to that, specifically George Washington. And this whole vast estate was pretty much built and maintained by the enslaved people here. Who he kept, but in his will he did mention that he wanted them all to be sold off. He just didn't have the power to sell them. He just didn't have the rights to sell them at the time. Another thing I wanted to mention was there's a key in there. If you followed my channel for any length of time, you know I work at the Utah State Prison. So anytime prison stories come up, I am very interested. I found out when I toured this building that there's a prison key from the Bastille in France that was gifted to George Washington by Lafayette. Now Lafayette helped the American Revolution. The French helped with the American Revolution. Lafayette was very impressed by George Washington and what he had done and his bravery in the war, and also in becoming the first president of the United States. Gave him this key to the Bastille in France, which was a prison, and the key is up there in the house in a glass case. And I was looking at that key and I'm like, that looks exactly like the keys that we use at the Utah State Prison. So I took a photo of it. I just thought it was kind of a cool little part of a side. And it's mentioned briefly in the book, George Washington's relationship with Lafayette. Another thing that is mentioned in the book, and also that I learned on the tour here, is George Washington was such a famous individual at the time, probably the most famous man on the planet. And a lot of people in the United States, or in that early 13 colonies, wanted him to be king or president for his life. They wanted presidents to just become president until they died, and then someone else would take over. And George Washington was very adamant that, no, I am going to serve 2 terms and that's it. Presidents should only serve 2 terms. And he stuck to his guns on that, even despite all the pressure that people put on him. And not only that, but if you're king of the United States, who wouldn't like jump all over that, right? But he stuck to his principles and his ethics, and he made the transition between himself and the president number 2, John Adams, go as smoothly as possible, which is probably something that the presidents that we have nowadays could learn from. That's all I'm going to say about that. Anyway, this is just cool. This is super cool. It's dope to come and visit places like this and see places like the Potomac. I've never seen the Potomac River before, but that's beautiful, man. Well, aside from this shitty fence they got right here, that fence is real nice. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about the book and my little writing advice. You know, come and visit places. If you're going to write historical things, just learn history, learn about the country you live in. Wear your American flag masks. His Excellency by Joseph J. Ellis, Biography of George Washington. I give it a 10 out of 10. It's just written beautifully. And when you combine this to a visit to Mount Vernon, it's just the only way to read books and video.